It's time to get your music radio ready with the AudioSkills Podcast. It doesn't matter what type of music you're creating or what gear you use. It's all about the technique. Get ready to turn your home studio into a place where your music goes platinum. Now give it up for your host, Scott Hawksworth.
Hey everyone, Scott Hawksworth, founder of AudioSkills.com, back with you for yet another episode of the AudioSkills Podcast. We've got a fascinating show for you this week where we're going to be talking about sound design for Broadway with the help of my buddy Jason Crystal, who worked on the sound design for the smash hit Hamilton. I think this show is going to have some great insight for those who are curious to learn more about critical listening and how some of the same tools that we use in music production are used in different audio disciplines. And of course, this is going to be helpful for anyone who might be interested in live sound. But before getting into all that, I wanted to jump right into the audio tip of the week. I offer up tips and tutorials on audioskills.com and on our YouTube channel, but I want to make sure that podcast listeners also get some key takeaways to help them make better music as well. So with that said, the tip of this week is all about how to more effectively listen to and evaluate your mixes. So one of the biggest things you should do while you are mixing is change your listening perspective. This will help you mix more effectively in general and make sure that your mix translates well. So what do I mean by mix translation? Well, before you ever consider a mix to be finished, you should listen to it in as many environments as possible to make sure that it sounds good regardless of the medium. Don't only work from your desk chair right in front of your monitors or on a pair of headphones. Listen to your mix on a pair of crummy old computer speakers. Take it out to your car and listen to it. Listen to it on a pair of earbuds. Your music is hopefully going to be heard across a wide range of mediums in a bunch of different systems. So making sure that everything translates well is key. And as for how changing your listening perspective can actually help you mix more effectively in general, it can give you more information about how all your tracks are behaving. If you've got too much low end, maybe that won't be as obvious on one pair of speakers as it will be on another. And then here's just a little bonus tip too, and I don't know exactly why this is, so don't ask me to explain the science behind it, but for whatever reason, listening to a mix just outside of the room with the door closed is a fantastic way to check it and find any flaws. Again, you're having a different perspective. Try it out and you might hear things that you never heard before. So bottom line, to kind of sum all of this up, always be mindful of changing your listening perspective and checking your mix on a variety of mediums. So with that said, now it's time to move on to our main topic of discussion for this week. And I'm joined by Jason Crystal, who is a sound designer, engineer, and programmer for live performance. And he's currently working on the Broadway sensation Hamilton, which is just a fantastic show. And if you have the opportunity, you should absolutely go see it. He's been with them since the beginning of its incredible run. So Jason, how are you doing today, man?
I'm good. How are you, Scott?
Oh, I'm doing great. You're back in New York now. I know you were in San Francisco. Is that correct?
Yes, we were setting up, I guess, the third national company of the show. We're currently running on Broadway and in Chicago, and as of a couple weeks ago, San Francisco.
Oh, right on. So kind of to start us off here, especially for those who may not be familiar with your line of work, can you tell us just a little bit about your profession and really at a high level, what do you do for a show like Hamilton?
It's kind of a lot of hats, actually. So, professionally, I gig in a lot of different ways. I'm a designer, I'm an engineer, I'm a stagehand. I kind of do a lot of different things. So Hamilton is one of many gigs I do. It's a really good one. So it's been occupying a lot of my time lately, and it's definitely special. So my job there, I actually have kind of two distinct roles at Hamilton. One is I'm the associate sound designer. So Nevin Steinberg is the sound designer for Hamilton, and that applies to, all companies. And I've been working with him for many years. My job is to basically implement his sound system, or as he envisions the sound system to be, both technically and artistically. So my job involves everything from creating an equipment list to figuring out how it's going to get cabled and programmed and training the crew to operate the equipment, and basically everything from we've decided to put on a show through to opening night and making sure everything functions correctly. I also am the sound supervisor for the show, which means once the show opens, I'm not necessarily done with it. I'm on call for any technical problems. I help maintain the show both artistically and technically. If there are infrastructure changes needed, if there are personnel changes that happen, I'm around for those sorts of things, or, outside events or anything pertaining to the show that requires upkeep. So yeah, that's kind of my role there.
Wow. So yeah, absolutely a lot of different hats there that you're wearing on any given day. So my second question, and I guess you already kind of answered this, is, do you tend to come in at the beginning of a show's run and actually run the mixing board or anything like that and then hand it off? Or kind of, can you speak more to that process?
Yeah. I mean, what would typically no. I mean, typically I don't mix the show. I'm involved in programming the console, but on a Broadway musical, typically there would be a separate engineer who would actually operate the desk. So I'll talk a little bit about the team. So like the audio team on a Broadway musical is typically a designer, an associate, which is me. Sometimes we'll have a design assistant or an intern. And then beyond that, there's actually the crew, which is basically, usually it's a production head of some sort who's actually in charge of running the load in, actually installing the speakers and dealing with the local labor and like the physical, we're going to put the speaker in the air and here's how we're going to do it. And then there's actually the running crew, which are the people who actually operate the show, which is typically 2 or 3 people, usually an engineer and 1 or 2 backstage people to wrangle microphones. So that's kind of the team. So, from there you can kind of deduce what everyone's job is. So I typically work very closely with the mixer, both technically, like here's how for something like Hamilton, I already know what the show, I'm not kind of discovering what the show is. It's a new show, but it's not the first time we've done it. So at this point, a lot of my connections with the mixer is both technical, like here's how we're going to do this. And secondarily artistic, here's what we want it to sound like and why.
Right. So obviously working very closely with them if you're not actually, sitting there at the mixing board, but you're like over his shoulder almost.
Correct. Yeah, I'm over his shoulder. Yes, I've spent probably well over 100 performances of Hamilton over the shoulders of various mixers. So yes.
There you go. So now how do you go about setting up the monitoring for the cast and the band in a show like Hamilton so they can hear everything well and kind of know what's going on, obviously?
It's actually fairly detailed. So in a general sense, everyone needs to hear what they need to perform. So like if you're an actor on stage, you need to hear the orchestra or the band, or else you don't know what you're singing along to. And if you're the band, and the band has challenges because, depending on everything is very closely tied to the instrumentation, the orchestration of a show. But typically, if you're in a band, you need to hear the other players in the band. So the question is, how do we do that? Now, on something like Hamilton, there's a lot of electronic instruments. So there are, in fact, instruments that make no acoustic sounds at all. If you were to watch the show from the orchestra pit, there are times where people are really jamming out and making absolutely no sound. So unless you're in the house or have a pair of headphones on, you hear nothing, which is kind of an entertaining place to be. So the way we do that is a variety of ways. So on stage for the cast, we have monitors. We have basically speakers embedded all over the place. We have speakers in the deck. We have speakers in the set. We have speakers overhead. We have speakers off stage and on stage, and a lot of them are hidden in the set, just so we can basically subtly get monitoring on stage. We don't, we're not afforded like big wedge monitors or anything because it's a show, it's a play, right?
Yeah, that would take people out of the.
I think so, and I think the scenic designer would probably agree as well. And then in the band, everyone has basically a personal mixer. We use a system by Aviom where everyone has basically a 17-channel mixer in front of them, which they have basically every player on a handle plus vocals and click track and any pre-recorded stuff and, various utility sends as well. So every player can generate what they need in order to hear on headphones the mix they need in order to play. So it's pretty detailed from that end. And as I said, that would be totally different on another show, on a show that's maybe more acoustic. Maybe we don't have headphones at all and you just listen like we all used to do when we were, in bands and orchestras back in the day or old school musicals. It really varies, but the electronics of Hamilton kind of necessitates a system kind of like this. You may also be interested to know, I'm going to back up a little bit. I keep talking about equipment lists and the equipment we're using. All of it's brought in. We go into a theater, there's no equipment there to begin with. So when it becomes very much about, we need this for this purpose for this show. There's a lot of that. And that's everything from like the speakers and microphones to the cable and the intercom and like all the infrastructure. So when you walk into a Broadway theater, it's literally, they call it four walls, but it's literally, it's an empty room. You get house lights, you get a fly system, and you get kind of a main power cam lock disconnect. And that's pretty much it. And we go from there.
Wow. So kind of moving on to my next question here, and I think this really ties in perfectly to what you were just saying. So with production as successful as Hamilton, where, you've mentioned it's in New York, it's in Chicago, it's now in San Francisco, and I believe you guys are going to London here in a few months. How do you capture the same sonic experience there, or do you strive to capture that, like, okay, this is going to sound like it sounded on Broadway? Do you listen to recordings from that, or do you just know what you're listening for after having done hundreds of shows, or how does that work?
That's a good question. We don't do a lot of listening to recordings because actually listening to a recording, in no way will seeing the show sound like the recording. It's just physically impossible, right? Like the cast album for the show is unbelievable, but there's no way we would ever be able to produce that in a 2,000 seat theater with omnidirectional microphones, a live band, and walls. So the result of that is we basically, our reference is very much our memory of the show, but it's also, applicable to the specific venue you're in. So while we're going for something familiar, we all know, well, I say we, it's not the royal we, it's the sound department of the show. We know what it sounds like on Broadway, and I know what it sounds like in Chicago, and those don't sound the same. They're similar. The impact, I'd like to think is very similar, but it is not physically possible for it to sound the same way. They're different venues, they're different sound systems, and different audiences, so our theater on Broadway is about 1,300 seats, and there's one balcony and an orchestra level. In Chicago, we're up to 1,800 seats, and there are 3 balconies. So even that alone has a huge impact on how the show is going to sound. And that's before you factor in maybe our choices of equipment and other concerns. So basically what we're going for is to mimic the same feel and impression and story of the show. And often that results in sounding familiar to us, but we're not trying to necessarily match it.
Right. No, that makes a lot of sense. So kind of moving on to my next question, equalization is used when producing recorded music. I know our listeners here will be very familiar with EQs, but of course also has applications to live sound. And, how do you utilize equalization for performances like Hamilton?
There's EQ at a lot of steps for us. So I guess the most basic EQ we're using is system EQ. So we actually have EQ on various outputs of our system. So I was just from San Francisco, so that's like fresh in my mind, but we have something like 96 or 100 outputs from the sound system. So we have EQ at each of those outputs. So that's how we would apply equalization on speakers and line arrays and anything kind of audience facing. Same with, we have a full surround system. So those all have EQ and processing. We have EQ on all those onstage monitors I was talking about. So we would typically refer to that as system EQ or output EQ. And that's probably the primary tool for actually tuning the sound system, by actually like making the sound system sound linear and predictable and consistent across various listening areas and speaker types. So that's kind of EQ number one. Kind of backing up in the signal chain, we also have EQ on our various buses. So we have various vocal buses and instrument buses, and sometimes special effects and reverbs and all kinds of additional console routing busing. And so in there, we also have EQ. So if we determine basically all of the vocal mics, for example, require an adjustment, that's a good place we might go to make an adjustment to kind of system-wide stuff without actually affecting what we call the delivery system or the speaker system. And then backing up further, there's obviously EQ on our inputs. So that becomes about the specific player or singer or instrument, or basically the raw source material, anything that's particular to that channel strip. So the short answer is yes, EQ factors in very much in a live performance. And we take a lot of thought in determining where exactly to apply that EQ based on what we're trying to accomplish.
Sure. That's really interesting too about what you were saying with the inputs. So obviously in you're going to have different actors playing the same roles. So they're going to have different voices. So I guess you would have to manually just say, oh, so-and-so, ooh, he's got too much bass or something like that, and we might want to adjust that or something like that. Is that kind of how you would approach it?
Yeah, we kind of approach the input side twice. Once in a generic way, meaning, we want the vocal mics to sound like this, and we want the snare drum to sound like this, and the kick drum to sound like this, and the violin to sound like this, and we would put an EQ curve of some sort on there. And typically we would do that during our rehearsal and preview process. We typically will preview the show for a few weeks before we actually open, during which we can continue to make adjustments. So we would set in basically a baseline EQ on these things, and typically that would be associated with the primary performer. So whoever the lead is, basically not understudies. We would typically do this for anyone who's the main person who's going to play this role or play this instrument. Then once we start getting understudies and covers into the show, because, you're not going to have the same person playing the same role every performance forever. So we will then generate an additional EQ curve for what we call players. And the reason we call them players is because the software we use actually calls them players. So we've adopted the terminology, but there's a mechanism in our particular console where you can say it's this channel strip, but someone else is playing this channel strip. So you can decide, what does that mean? And in the case of Hamilton, we've decided that means they get their own EQ. It means they get their own dynamics processing, and it means they get their own input digital trim. And those three parameters travel with the person who's playing that character and not the character itself. Whereas things like aux sends or muting or panning, things like that, travel with the actual channel strip regardless of who's playing the role.
Right. Wow, that's fascinating. Now, kind of staying on this topic of EQ, in recorded music, there's an idea of additive versus subtractive EQing, cuts versus boosts. And there's, different schools of thought on things that different mixing engineers and such like to use. So do you guys sort of have a philosophy around that? Is it better to cut than to boost? Do you try to just say, can we make like a small cut rather than trying to boost something up? Or is there any kind of thought there?
I don't know if it's a philosophy so much as kind of just a tendency or an accepted way of doing it. I mean, we tend to cut our EQs down rather than boost things up. And I guess, I don't actually have a scientific explanation for that, but I guess the best rationale I would propose is, this way, you're actually removing frequency content that's in the signal and not trying to create frequency content that isn't there. So, I'm sure some very scientific listener of your podcast will correct me on that. The standard operating procedure is we tend to cut out things we don't need. That being said, there are times where we use boosts. I'm not afraid of using boosts. It's not uncommon to use a boost. It's just not kind of our default disposition.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. One thing, just kind of a separate point, why I like to say, cut before you boost in general. If you think about it logically, when you make a cut to a frequency, you are naturally, the frequencies, surrounding that are going to then be emphasized more because you're removing that. So that's kind of a simpler move than if you were, say, you were boosting frequencies either lower than higher than that, kind of a shortcut almost, if that makes any sense. So, and you were touching on this a little bit before, you mentioned things like reverb and such. So do you make use of things like reverb and delay and in your sound design? And then if so, when and why would you use it?
I'll start with delay, which we use in kind of two very different ways. So integral to the functioning of the sound system is delay. And we're not delay as an effect, but delay as a utility. So, we have a massive sound system in the theater. So we're often timing the outputs of speakers back to the source or back to another sound system, right? So we actually have to apply delay on our speakers so as to make them line up with either the other speakers or the source. So there's very kind of utility delay on the output side. We'd call that system delay. When you're sitting at the back of the theater and you're listening to basically 4 sound systems come at you, they line up in a coherent way.
So if I may, you played in marching band at Northwestern.
I did.
I know this is a common thing that marching bands have to deal with when they are on the field. And, maybe the audience is singing or something like that. And just because of natural, how sonic waves work, the timing might be off between the audience and the band. So that kind of thing.
Yeah. Sound is, relatively very slow. So we do a lot of footwork with getting things to line up. Like a great example of that is actually in a sports stadium of some sort. If you were to go to like a baseball field and hear the sound of someone hitting a baseball, you're probably going to hear it quite a bit after the baseball actually gets hit. If you ever like watch someone hit a baseball and then listen, depending on how far away you are, it can be well over, half a second that you've actually waited to hear the sound of the baseball being hit. And so when we're dealing with venues that are of the size as we are, or even smaller venues, the moment that your system isn't lining up correctly, you will hear it. There's within a few milliseconds, it just sounds odd. And at a certain amount of time, it just sounds wrong, so we spend a lot of time timing that. And we do that all kind of, analytically, we use various measurement systems. And I mean, not to mention we listen, but we do our initial pass at EQ and delay on the system using measurement. So yeah. And then the whole goal often, this is not universal, but the whole goal is typically to be transparent, right? There's someone on stage singing, and even if you're 200 feet away, you want to believe that you're hearing that person. They'd obviously be unnaturally loud, but you still want to focus on them and not focus on the speaker system. So that's why we're so focused on timing back to performers.
Sure. So that would be delay. And then why might you use some reverb?
Oh God. Oh, you know what? And I skipped the other half of delay. So the other half of delay. Well, so we often will delay on the input side. We will often delay actors basically as you move upstage, meaning away from the audience. As you move upstage, we'll often apply delay to them to continue their syncness with the sound system, right? Because if you move 20 feet upstage and you're continuing to sing, the sound system is now way ahead of you. So we will often delay on the input so that an actor can continue to time correctly with the sound system.
And that would be adjusted just as they're kind of moving around the stage?
Correct, yeah. And then the last kind of bit we would use delay is there's a moment in the show, Hamilton specifically, we're using delay as an effect. It's not a functional delay. It's we're making kind of an artistic choice with delay. And that is, I don't know if you're familiar with the show and the song Wait For It. There's a number of, we delay Burr's vocals on a couple of occasions in that number. And that's actually, that's a totally different type of delay, but it's obviously the same function.
Sure. And then how about reverb?
Reverb we use quite a bit. It's not a reverb heavy show, but it's kind of pretty consistent. So we'll use reverb often on the orchestra to help kind of flesh them out and make them a little less dry. The whole band is close mic'd, so as a result, we don't get which is good for us. I mean, it gives us as much control as we can. The flip side is it's often very dry source, so we'll use reverb with the band to kind of get them into the room or make them appear to be in a room with us and not just in a contained pit somewhere, which is where they actually are. We also have, reverb on our vocals, which we use actually fairly sparingly in the show, but there are moments where we have reverb on, it's mostly on the ensemble in the group singing. And then there are moments where we actually have a little bit of reverb on some of our principal soloists on certain numbers. But those reverb settings are definitely tweaked moment to moment. They're very specifically programmed and not overused and not kind of left to chance. There's no like, we have this much reverb on them and then that's it. It really is, by each musical number or even by each section of a musical number.
Oh, yeah, that's great. And I think that's just a good takeaway in general of any kind of music, any kind of production, doing things with intention. It sounds like, if you guys use reverb, it's for a very specific reason in a very specific way to achieve a specific goal. So now you've kind of touched on this a little bit, but when you enter a new space, you're expected to design the sound in, and you've mentioned that you guys bring in all of your, equipment and things like that. And you first start listening. So, okay, you've got your equipment, you've started plugging things in and all that. What kinds of things are you specifically listening for and evaluating?
The first thing we're evaluating is whether the system is actually just doing what we intended it to do, right? So we spend a lot of time with software predicting what our sound system will sound like, right? So we have various manufacturers have various tools, and there are some generic tools that you can actually draw a venue in software. You can plunk speakers into it, and you can predict what the phase and frequency response of your sound system will look like at various physical locations in a venue. So we spend a lot of time, Nevin, the sound designer particularly, and this is maybe one of his favorite parts of doing this whole thing, is predicting what the correct equipment might be to accomplish what he wants. So the equipment list stems in a lot of ways from those predictions. So the first thing we might do when we walk into a venue, we'll run in the venue a number of times prior to actually installing the system, right? We're in there basically taking measurements and looking at the system and figuring out where we might be able to hang things and what the physical constraints of a venue might be. But when we actually get to the point of actually loading the stuff in, the first thing we're going to listen for is everything working? And, that starts with an actual measurement, like, is the speaker producing the frequency range we expect it to produce? Is the dispersion pattern covering the areas, the seating areas we want it to? Does it need to be physically adjusted? Is there an electronic problem? Basically analyzing the sound system. So that's kind of step one. Once we have the system checked out, we'll do a system tuning on it, and then we'll start to listen. And, the number of things we listen to vary. It starts off with just coverage. Can you hear the sound system in a reasonable way in every seats? And that's about both leveling your various outputs and speakers. That's about the dispersion of speakers, making sure they're pointed appropriately. That's about the type of speaker and making sure it actually is producing at the level we need it to. And then it gets down to, frequency response, making sure we're hearing the entire range of audio that we can possibly hear. And then making sure it images correctly. So we're listening to a lot of, it's one thing. Imagine you're sitting in a theater and you're all the way against the side wall. You may have a speaker just like directly in front of you that's every bit as loud as every other speaker and sounds great. But it in no way does it sound like it's actually coming from the stage. It's just the speaker off to the side covering you, right? So while that would measure to be the appropriate volume, it's not doing what we want, is to actually image the source to the stage, right? So we spend a lot of time ratioing speakers, both with time and amplitude, to actually draw the audience's attention back to the stage, which is the whole point of this whole exercise, right? So just because you're covered doesn't mean it's good. So that's kind of the third, leg of the triangle that we're trying to stand on is it believably coming from the stage?
Do you or members of your team, do you like individually go and like sit in each seat in a theater and say, okay, how does it sound here? How does it sound here? Or no?
Each seat, but each area, like each seat would be a little impractical, but, definitely each like section of the theater gets a lot of attention. Typically either Nevin, the designer, or myself will sit in each section, not just during rehearsal, but also during performances. We'll spend act one in one section and act two in another section, or an entire performance in the balcony. And, over the course of 20 some previews, we'll have a pretty good idea of what the show is like during a performance in every area of the theater. And that's after, a week or two of rehearsals where we have obviously free reign to move about the theater all we want and make those adjustments. So we're often adjusting. It's not unusual to be adjusting the sound system in real time during a performance, during a preview performance. And so the short answer is yes, we do. While we don't hit every seat, we definitely take great care with every section.
Right. And that kind of goes back to what you were saying about the image and make sure that everything is consistent. So now, when working in any audio pursuit, developing a critical ear and listening critically is tremendously important. Obviously, there's some obvious things like, oh, this sounds way too loud here, but I think there's more subtleties as well. What advice might you have for folks who are trying to improve their critical listening skills? Because it is a different way to listen to something than it is, if you're just listening for pleasure. And how have you sort of developed your skills there?
You're certainly right. And it's a much more tiring way to listen too. But, I don't actually have like the quick answer to that, but, just listen a lot and make opinions. If you're critically listening, it means you're actually like you're running like an RTA in your brain all the time. And you're trying to figure out like, is this sounding the way I intended to? And if not, how might it be better? And it's just basically having that loop running in your head all the time. For me, I've spent a lot of time just basically mucking with the sound system, like just try something and listen, and what I guess the advice I would give is be patient. It's very easy to feel rushed, particularly in a live environment where if something doesn't sound right, you only have until that person's done singing or the scene is over or the show ends to actually solve it. Right. So, it's very easy to like grab an EQ knob and like try to make a change before like the person goes off stage. Right. So the advice I would have is actually to be patient, is to make a change, make one single defined change, and then listen again, make a decision about the change and move on to the next one. If you're flailing, then you're actually not moving in a predictable way. So it's basically about being deliberate and not scattershotting for me, for actually the transition from critical listening to actually making an adjustment is where the rubber meets the road. Like you can listen and make an opinion all you want, but then what you do with that opinion is really the magic, right? So you can sit there and so sitting there critically listening, deciding what it sounds like, and then deciding what you want it to sound like should then translate into a specific action wherein you then have to sit and listen again.
Yep. No, that makes perfect sense. And I think that also circles back to, what I was talking about before with the intention, the idea that okay, the first part of it is, yes, the critical listening, but then the second part is now make a specific change with your end goal in mind. Don't just say, oh, well, I know this isn't right, so I'm just going to flip a knob here and hope for the best and hope that improves it. So I know that you were fortunate to design the sound in the White House for a Hamilton performance there. And I saw the pictures on Facebook, and I am just curious, what was that experience and process like?
It was a pretty surreal couple days. Not gonna lie. So designing the sound at the White House is a little, I think that may be overstating it a bit. Like we got word that they wanted to do a concert of the show for the first family. And so we all flipped out, I think, which, we couldn't help ourselves. But none of us, surprisingly, had ever worked in the White House before. So we got in touch with a vendor that we know and trust and has done work in the East Room, which is where the concert was. So we basically said, listen, we know about the front end of the system, meaning the mics, the people, the band, the console. We know all that stuff. What we don't know is what system will be great on the back end, what speaker system we need for this room. So help us out, basically. So they basically brought us a whole bunch of equipment that they know worked well in that room. So we trusted them to provide the sound. It was a one-off, right? It wasn't like an installation. It wasn't, as these things go, high precision. It was high stakes, but it wasn't high precision. So the speaker system was entirely functional, and the people who needed to hear the show definitely heard the show. And I think it was a very successful night, but the specificity of the sound system was nothing like what we would do in the theater. So the actual process was a little hilarious, because suddenly you're like running cables and like hanging a thing and programming a console, and then you look up and you're like, oh, right, I'm in the White House. And then you keep going, right? So it was a pretty surreal day, and you're like, I got to go to the bathroom. Oh, I can't go to the bathroom unescorted? That's weird. And so there are all these rules and interesting tidbits that is like a combination of, I'm just doing my normal job. This is not my normal job. Anyway, but the Obamas loved the concert. They met all of us. They said very nice things. Joe Biden photobombed us at one point. Anyway, the short answer was it was a concert. We skipped around the show. The director basically narrated the show for the audience. It was the full cast and the full band performing for, I'm going to get the number wrong, but I think it was a couple hundred people. It was basically the first family and the people they wanted to invite. And that was it. And then we, struck the sound system. So it was like a normal one-off in a completely abnormal place.
Yeah, no, that's pretty fascinating. So, okay, we're closing up a bit here, but I had just two more questions. So for you, what's the most frustrating aspect of, working in sound design for theater?
I think, and I think you could probably appreciate this, I think it's how uncontrolled the environment is. Like you're just you have an omnidirectional mic somewhere on someone's face in a giant room. And the difference between that and a nice microphone in a studio in front of someone's mouth is such a difference, right? Like, and I guess frustrating may not be may not be the right word for that.
Maybe
it may
challenging.
Be like, challenging. I like that. That's more optimistic. But it is the challenge of delivering something in real time, which, while I guess frustrating compared to a studio environment, is really rewarding because, everyone's doing it now, so it's pretty, the results are pretty cool, but I guess it's frustrating in the sense that we can bring in all the equipment we want. And in the end, we only have so much control of, the event.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. I'm sure that's something that similarly someone who maybe does just straight up live mixing for music or something would also, that would be a challenge for them as well. So then to end on a high note, what's the best aspect of working in sound design for theater for you?
What's funny is I think it's the other side of that coin, which is everyone's doing everything right now. You're in a room with collaborators and actors and other designers of other disciplines and experts in their field all at the same time. You're not like, it's not like someone shoots the film and then someone does the audio and someone edits it together and you never all meet, this is like literally everyone who's making a piece of art is in the room together simultaneously, and how the collaboration happens, you can have all the meetings and emails you want, but the moment you're all in the room together, all options are on the table. The moment you're in a room with the writer and the director and all the designers and a conductor, and, it becomes a pretty special environment for actually accomplishing anything you want. So I think that's probably the neatest part is, despite the absurd hours we all work during those days, it is a special time because you have everyone you need.
Yeah, and I can imagine that the payoff is pretty good when you're listening to it and the show is and the actors are nailing everything and the orchestra's great and it sounds great and you're like, wow, we all did this and we're rocking this right now.
Yeah, but it can be pretty rewarding for sure.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Jason, for joining me today. This is really fascinating. And, for folks out there who might be interested in getting into sound design for theater, or even folks who, are just recording and mixing music at home, I think some of the big key takeaways here are, be patient, develop your critical ear, listen. And, when you are making changes to a mix or in any kind of audio, I really think that intent is so important in having a direction and a goal in mind rather than just kind of making changes willy-nilly, because that's where you sort of get off the rails. And you can see from, what Jason does, where at a high level, working on a Broadway production where this intent is so critical to the process. Jason, thanks again so much. And you're going to be going to London later this year. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's true. That's the next one. So we'll be setting this up in London in October, November with an opening in December. So that's the next one.
Right on. Well, good luck with that. And I'm sure by this time it's kind of like old hat for you. This will be your fourth place setting it up, correct?
It's old hat, but it's no less high pressure, I guess. We know what we're doing, but it's a challenge still.
Right on. Well, that's all for our show today. A huge thank you to Jason for joining me. And if you'd like to learn more about his work, you can find him at jasoncrystal.com. Thank you guys so much for listening today. And for more links and information about today's show and our guest, you can check out our show notes at audioskills.com/podcast. Go out there and make some great music.
Ready to go even deeper with your recording, mixing, and music production? We've got all the info and techniques you need in one place so you can turn it up. Go to audioskills.com and access a huge library of video tutorials and private workshops so you make progress even faster. Come back next week for a brand new episode of the Audio Skills Podcast.